Hello, I'm Patty Leach, and welcome to Los Altos History. Today we're going to digress just a little bit to our neighbor immediately north of us, to Palo Alto. And we have as our special guests Nancy Lund and Pam Gullard, who have just written a book on Palo Alto. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Tell me, why a book on Palo Alto?
Well, the centennial is coming up in 1894, and as far as writing is concerned, we feel that's just around the corner. And the city of Palo Alto is going to come up with a big bash for the centennial. So we hope people will come to the various events. So the 100 years is just about here. And in fact, 1889 is a year that's can be commemorated in Palo Alto history because the plat, the first map of Palo Alto, was filed about 100 years ago today.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So we started looking around to see what there already was on Palo Alto's history, and we found that there was a book written in the 30s, and there was a book written in the 50s, and there was a beautiful book written in 1969 for the Diamond Jubilee. All of them are out of print. They're individual copies in the reserve desk of the library where you leave your library card, your driver's license, your child, and you can take a look at one. We thought it was time that Palo Alto and their neighbors had a chance to know their interesting story.
I think that's wonderful, and this will be available for everybody to see.
Right.
Tell me, what are your backgrounds? How did you get into this?
I actually primarily am a fiction writer, although like most fiction writers, I've done a lot of nonfiction as well. I publish short stories in literary magazines, and I also work on book reviewing. I've done book reviewing for the San Francisco Chronicle.
Wonderful,
So.
wonderful. Nancy?
And I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for so long that I've stopped counting. And I guess I got interested in California history and local history way back in 1973 when I took a class in California history at Foothill and another class in local studies at De Anza, so that I would know more than my fourth grade students. And I found that the history was interesting and that historical research was great fun. So I've been interested since then. I've also was a founding member of the Los Altos History House Auxiliary, which is your place.
Wonderful.
And I am a founding member of the Portola Valley Archives Committee, where I serve now. So long interest in history
is
for
not
me.
New.
Writing for Pam.
I think you two that's a wonderful combination for this type of endeavor.
It's worked well.
Yeah, it has worked really well, and we think one of the reasons is because of having the strong historical background, and also we didn't want our history to be dry and just a set of facts. So we want to tell a story. So we spent a lot of time figuring out what that story was, as you know, as a historian yourself. Sometimes it's hard to know what the facts are. But then when the people come into it, you want to know their characters. And it really is sort of a problem of fiction, is to bring out their characters and their personalities so it really comes alive.
So this is really something that reads well and that will be interesting to more people, as opposed to the typical, what people stereotype as the dry history.
Well, that's what we hope,
Yeah.
yes.
Let's talk about the book for a little bit. What was Palo Alto like before people?
It was wonderful to look into that. One of the sources we used there was a thesis that was written in San Francisco State by David Mayfield. And he described a beautiful country here with grizzlies right where, you know, downtown Palo Alto was, and the California condor, which, as we all know, is just about extinct, flew over the bay, and there was salmon in the creeks that bubbled through Palo Alto. There were many more creeks. And also the bay itself rose much higher. There probably was swampland all the way up to Middlefield. So you can picture this. It was a luxuriant, beautiful place.
Very pristine.
Yes.
Sounds like.
Trees everywhere.
Trees and oak trees. One of the explorers, especially Alfred Robinson, mentioned that it looked like an English park because there were these towering oaks that had grown for hundreds of years, and the Indians who were here had burned underneath because they improved their seed crop that way.
Who were the Indians that were here?
They were the Ohlone Indians, a name that's been made up since they were here in any abundance. And
they lived here for 5,000 years.
Yes.
And of course they were in present-day Los Altos area as well.
Yes.
Geographical range was quite extensive in California.
Many villages here and there along the creeks, along the bay, and they gathered acorns and they lived. It's amazing to us for 5,000 years without destroying the environment in any way, and then all of a sudden, boom.
And what happened?
Well, actually, we have to start, as you well know, with the missionaries who came in about 1769. Mm-hmm. They were the Spanish missionaries, and they came. Each of the missionaries was paired with one of the military people, and they came to secure really Alta California for Spain and established the 21 missions. Mission Santa Clara was near here. And there was a misunderstanding or a clash of cultures, or however you want to put it, between the Ohlone and the missionaries. And so essentially, in many ways, the Ohlone were enslaved, more or less, in the missions. And they died of European diseases. They died because they were murdered. And it is sort of a sad episode in the history of California.
But you tell this story in the book, and
yes.
I think that that is a story that has not been told in previous histories, particularly at the school level. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important. Who were the first European settlers to come to our area?
Well, after the missionaries, or along with the missionaries, the Spaniards began to come in, although the Spaniards had come from Mexico, because by 1821 California was owned by Mexico, and so it is very typical to talk about the Spanish land grants, but there weren't very many Spanish land grants. The land grants here were Mexican, and I think there was one or two in Los Altos. Palo Alto really had only three families owning all of Palo Alto, and then the famous Juana Briones, who was right on the border between Los Altos and
we shared that rancho.
Palo Alto Hills. Yes, her house has just been demolished or damaged in the earthquake. They're hoping to be able to save it. Mm-hmm. So, and then a little bit of one from the Portola Valley area, Maximo Martinez's rancho, spilled over by Foothill Park, but that was the era of the ranchos. The Mexican rancheros held sway over the land.
How long was the rancho era?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because there was no clearly defined beginning and end. In Palo Alto area, most of the ranchos began in the 1840s, which was rather late, 20 years after Mexico had gained possession of California. And they began to end almost as soon as they began. Some of the rancheros lived on into the times when Palo Alto began as a town and provided a link between the two cultures, but really just that little short era maybe of 10, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell us, if anything, in your research that would convey what rancho life was like? Anything?
Yeah, it's hard. The rancheros mostly didn't read or write, and so diaries or letters haven't turned up. Accounts of from settlers who talked to the rancheros maybe came. The family life was important. The 29 children in one family, large families. The church was important. The cattle, much life revolved around the cattle. What
caused it to end?
The coming of the Yankees, I think, more than anything. They began to spill into this era when the gold rush ended.
Okay.
And then they took over the land. It looked empty, and they settled on it.
Pretty much the gold rush and California being admitted into the Union.
Yes, right.
Of the century, James Gilbert Smith came to Los Altos and built a home there. He planted 10 acres of apricot trees where the Los Altos Civic Center stands today. Gilbert's home became the Los Altos History House Museum and maintains a wonderful collection of photographs, newspapers, artifacts, and memorabilia. In case you've never been to the museum, it's right behind the main library off San Antonio Road. The Museum Association sponsors specially guided tours for groups and a special children's tour with a hands-on program. You need to call in advance to set up tour dates. The number to call is 948-9427. The museum is open every Wednesday from 1 until 5 and on Saturdays from 12 to 4. The Museum Association members have an opportunity to volunteer at the museum, but also get to take part in the annual holiday tea, winter crab feed, spring antique fair, and summer barbecue. Come by the museum, or better yet, become a Museum Association member. We're talking about the history of Palo Alto, and let's get into, when did Palo Alto, the city, begin?
Well, we have to really start the story of Palo Alto with the story of Mayfield, which is a little town that existed for 75 years right along El Camino and California Avenue today. It was started in 1853 by a man named James Otterson, who was one of these people we mentioned that spilled into the area after the gold rush was over. He thought it would be a good place to have an inn right there at the intersection of the road into the Redwoods and the main highway between San Francisco and San Jose. So he started an inn. It was quite a successful place. It was not only an inn, dances were held there, and it just became a gathering place. A little town grew up around it. And then in 1867, a man by the name of William Paul filed the plat for Mayfield, and it became a regular little town, school and stores.
It seems to me I had heard something about Mayfield and the saloons. Is there a story that goes with that?
Well, the saloons were Mayfield's claim to fame, certainly, and they probably were the cause of its demise. There were somewhere between 14 and 20 altogether in this sleepy little town.
That's quite a number, actually.
Yes, yeah, it is.
It was a watering hole of the first order.
And it was there is the ribald side of it later on, the Stanford students coming down and so on, but there was also a darker side of a few newspaper accounts of places being shot up by gunmen and that sort of thing.
Oh right out of the Wild West.
Yes,
there.
True Wild West right here. But then one day when the Stanfords had decided they wanted to start their university here to honor their son, they realized they would need a town to provide services.
Now you're talking about the Leland Stanfords.
The Leland Stanfords, right. They went to Mayfield and they asked the citizens of Mayfield if they would like to be the university town. The only stipulation would be that the town would have to give up its saloons because the Stanfords wanted a sedate atmosphere for their students where they would not be led astray. Well, the Mayfieldians looked at this potential building and they thought, ha, a university? Nah, not there in the wheat fields. They liked their liquor. They said, no thank you.
Oh boy.
And so Leland Stanford went to his own town.
Well, he actually had gone to Mayfield and they turned him down in favor of the saloons, and then he went to present day university area. Which came first, the university or the town of Palo Alto?
The university came first. Now you have to imagine, I mean, when we say university, we think of, you know, Princeton and buildings and all this. Most part, except for Uncle Jim's cabin, was mostly a stickerweed field. And then there was also the Stanford stock farm. Because, as you know, Leland Stanford made his money as a railroad magnate, and then he decided that it was a little bit too rigorous, all this business life, and he had raised horses for a long time, and so the stock farm down here and made a reputation with horseflesh and raising prize trotters.
I guess that's where the expression "down on the farm" may come from.
Yes, that's exactly. And then there was another tragedy that's very well known in this area, which is that the Leland's only son died when he was about 15. And he was such a beloved boy that they wanted to build a memorial for him. And so they started erecting the university.
And what happened after the university was started? Where did people live?
Well, a lot of the people came from Cornell, a lot of the professors. And it's wonderful to read their accounts of showing up here. You can picture Cornell with the grassy fields and people thinking high thoughts. And here they came to this frontier, and it truly was a frontier. And so they decided, well, let's make the best of it, and they started settling in a small part of town we now call Professorville, and in old Palo Alto. So they were instrumental in making Palo Alto, to a large degree, what it is today.
Well, I know the Professorville neighborhood is quite well known historically and for its architecture. It is on the National Register, I believe. Well, looking at that, with the professors settling in Professorville, was Palo Alto just a university town?
Not really. There was a woman who started Palo Alto who is, we consider her the mother of Palo Alto, and her name is not known at all today, but we tell her story, and it's a wonderful story.
You have to sort of picture her. She was about 5 feet tall and tiny. She came to Palo Alto. She was the first Palo Alto in 1891. Did we say her name? And her name is Anna Shockey.
Shockey.
We think there should be a Shockey school.
Okay. Yeah. What is her story?
It's a wonderful name. And so she was a widow, widowed very young, had 3 little kids, and they moved into a barn in Palo Alto while their house was being built. And so here this widow looked around town, and as people came in, she decided, well, you know, we need our own school. Mayfield has a school, but we feel we should have Palo Alto's school district separate from Mayfield. So she and a fellow named John Parkinson went to the superintendent of schools, and he said, no, you're within 2 miles of Mayfield, and that's the sphere of influence. And so they looked at each other and they said, I'm not sure that that's true. So John Parkinson set out, and he figured out that sure enough, Palo Alto was just a little bit farther than 2 miles away from Mayfield.
Therefore, they could justify setting up the school.
Setting up their own schools. And to show you sort of the spirit of the people of Palo Alto, they built a school in 3 days. As soon as they got the yes,
oh my gosh,
all the able-bodied men
even today,
together.
That's unheard of.
It was on Bryant Street, and sure enough, they had a school, just sort of instantly.
Is the school still standing today?
No,
or?
It's not, which is unfortunate. And another thing about Anna Shockey, since we're on her, is she decided a few years later, in 1897, that the town needed its own high school. The high school kids had gone with the younger children. And so she mortgaged her house, built another house, and here's our high school. And so the high school's kids moved in.
Why, I noticed that your book is titled The History of Palo Alto, the Early Years, and that you ended at 1925. Why did you do that?
Well, we debated long and hard back when we started this project about where to end, and we thought we would tell the whole story of Palo Alto until history became current events. But when you tell the story and you want to capture texture and make the people come alive and make it seem real, that's an awful lot to try to do in one volume. So we stopped when Mayfield was annexed to Palo Alto in 1925.
So annexation was the key. Of the century, James Gilbert Smith came to Los Altos and built a home there. He planted 10 acres of apricot trees where the Los Altos Civic Center stands today. Gilbert's home became the Los Altos History House Museum and maintains a wonderful collection of photographs, newspapers, artifacts, and memorabilia. In case you've never been to the museum, it's right behind the main library off San Antonio Road. The Museum Association sponsors specially guided tours for groups and a special children's tour with a hands-on program. You need to call in advance to set up tour dates. The number to call is 948-9427. The museum is open every Wednesday from 1 until 5 and on Saturdays from 12 to 4. The Museum Association members have an opportunity to volunteer at the museum, but also get to take part in the annual holiday tea, winter crab feed, spring antique fair, and summer barbecue. Come by the museum, or better yet, become a Museum Association member. We're talking about the new book out on the history of Palo Alto with authors Nancy Lund and Pam Gullard. I'd like to ask you, in the course of your research, did anything happen while you were researching for this book that surprised you?
Yeah, I think the most important one maybe is the tree of Palo Alto.
Well, I was surprised about El Palo Alto. For many years I have told my students that
El Palo Alto,
the tree, the famous tree which gave Palo Alto its name. I told my students that Portola and the explorers camped under that tree, and this was planted there, signifying a mission would be built there one day. And to my amazement, I discovered that that probably was not the place the explorers camped at all, because El Palo Alto used to be a double-trunked tree. The second tree fell, the second part of it fell in about 1886. It was 960 years old at that time. The explorers drew maps and talked about a tree. They measured a single trunk tree. They drew a single trunk tree. So El Palo Alto probably was not the famous tree that the explorers camped under. Back around the turn of the century, it used to be great sport for Stanford students to climb to the top of the venerable symbol of the town and university to fly the flag of their class.
A tradition, right.
Yeah.
Pam, what did you find, if anything?
My story isn't quite as happy a one or as quirky. It's a story actually of all of California, and that is that there was bigotry early in Palo Alto history, particularly against Asians. You know of the Asian alien.
Well, there were the anti-exclusionary
Right.
acts and so forth.
Yes,
And
the Chinese Exclusion Acts.
Right.
And I think, as usual, it was an economic problem that when jobs were scarce, then there was a lot of feeling against the Asians in particular. And there was a large Chinese community along El Camino. So it is sort of shocking, actually, to read, for example, ads, real estate ads in early Palo Alto, and seeing, you know, right there in the ad, exclusionary phrases that, of course, are outlawed now. And even though that is shocking, it's very nice to see that Palo Alto has changed and California has changed in so many ways.
yes, that's true.
Oh my God.
Well, I want to ask you this, seeing all of the change that has occurred over the years, do you see anything that's the same? Are there any trends that you have noticed through the course of all of your research?
Well, there's certainly a trend that Palo Altans tend to care very deeply about their town and about their quality of life, and they're willing to work toward producing the quality that they wanted. People sometimes smile at Palo Alto's contentiousness or the concerns of the community about the cable boxes or about the leaf blowers, and yet I think the fact that they care about the small things in life make the quality what it is, and I think it's endured from the beginning when Anna Shockey and the women of the Women's Club cared about the town and looked for long-term solutions instead of quick fixes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also I think Palo Altans, possibly because of the connection with the university, have been able to see the larger context of the world. In World War I, especially, we were gratified to see the Belgian effort in Palo Alto. Lou Henry Hoover, who was the president's wife, spearheaded that nationwide. And it was really taken up in Palo Alto.
That's interesting.
Yes, and so there were Belgian fairs, wonderful Belgian fairs that were held during World War I in Palo Alto, where people dressed up in costume. And you can see the important people of Palo Alto gallivanting around. And they made, the women made small-sized clothing from the larger clothing that was donated for the Belgian children during World War I for
that's
Belgium.
significant.
Yes,
Significant.
yes, in that time it was quite a bit.
Tell me, what is it like for two people to write one book?
Ah, well, it depends on the two people, I suppose. There's many
Exactly.
answers to that as there are people. We've been working at this since 1983, so we're still friends.
So this is this took
exactly.
you 6 years then?
Right,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. I'm the historian a little bit, and Pam is the writer, so those two things complement one another. And we did a lot of talking about the style and the flavor that we wanted, and we did our individual research. And
Where did you do your research?
Well, let's see. You have to
How
always
did you get all of this wonderful information?
Yes.
and-
We should give due credit to the Palo Alto Historical Association, which has great pictures and just files and files of material, and more is coming in all the time.
So if someone wanted to do some research on Palo Alto, they would go to
that would certainly be the first place to go. And then we took what we called field trips to various places.
so we went to every repository that we could find, from the Bancroft in Berkeley to the California room of the San Jose Library. The mission, of course, was very important for the Indian Times and the Rancho Times, the mission at Santa Clara. The San Mateo County Archives. We interviewed people, some, Birch Clark before he died, and Joe Greer before he died. We felt privileged to have interviewed each of them because
I'm sure
they were
both
so
quite
important
well known.
to the past. Yes.
Okay. Why do you feel that local history is important? You first.
Let's see. Why
You
do I
must, or
feel-
you wouldn't have gotten involved in this project.
Yes, it is amazing when you see the names of the streets and suddenly they mean something to you. And also, I think in the world today, and maybe a little bit more in Palo Alto, it's easy to feel like there are no roots. And I have two boys, 3 and 1, and I like for them to know that a lot has happened before this current decade. A lot has happened earlier, and for them to be able to walk down the streets and think of Indians and walk down the streets.
I think that's important too.
of
Do you have any general final thoughts that you would like to leave with our viewers about history?
Well, for one, I think that every town has an interesting story, but it hasn't always been told. And we picked Palo Alto and tried to tell its story as best we can. And I think that there's a story in Los Altos that maybe somebody would sit down and write in a little more volume than it's been done so far. And I also think that it's a chance for people to stop and think about historic preservation for a minute. When I think that the Stanford Mansion on the university campus was torn down in 1965 and it was used for kindling and for the bonfire of the great big game, I think what a shame that was. If that building had been kept and the hospital, the children's hospital, moved further down the creek, maybe Palo Alto today would have its own history house, as Los Altos does, and just remind us of the past and of the people.
Pam, do you have a thought?
And the other thing is, I think the buildings that have been saved are just so wonderful. For example, when you go to the post office in Palo Alto, what I think of when I go to buy my Christmas stamps is Burge Clark, and I think
the
of
architect,
who built the post office. And you go through those arches, and you can see the early Spanish era influence on his work, and you can think of all the funny stories that he told.
Over 200 buildings to his credit. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, how can people get the book? Let's see. This I understand does come out in. It's going to be coming out in hardback and in paperback.
Right.
And where can people get it?
At bookstores.
After November 20th, it will be in the bookstores.
After November 20th.
Of 1989.
A wonderful Christmas present.
Yes.
That's great. Well, I want to thank both of you for being with us tonight.
It's our pleasure.
And we hope that you'll join us again for the next episode of Los Altos History.